Greetings, greenhouse people, and welcome to another installment of Tech on Demand, where our goal is always to bring you tips and tricks and information to help you produce your best crops ever. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and I am thrilled once again to be joined by Dr. Will Healy, who is the Senior Technical Manager at Ball Horticultural Company. We're here once again to talk about at-risk crops and the inherent challenges with specific crops grown all across North American greenhouses and around the world. So we're talking about some of the usual suspects, especially in this episode, but we're going to talk about plants that come under pressure by specific pests and diseases. And Dr. Healy is going to help us understand how to produce these crops by managing the pressures that come from these pests and diseases using preventative strategies. So in this episode, we're going to talk about carnations. And I think some of the challenges that we're going to talk about are ones that growers know well, right? It's fusarium and pythium and some of the others.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, I'm really excited about talking about these carnations because, Bill, this is a retro talk for me because I started working with carnations, well, let's just say when I was an undergrad, which of course was probably before you and most of the listeners hopefully were born. But, carnations at one time were a major crop. I did research on it for my master's and my PhD. And then also I was at Colorado State, which was really the epicenter of the carnation industry in the US. And I shouldn't say that after I started working with it, carnations kind of disappeared from North America, but the reality is, Bill, they did. And so a lot of people have forgotten about all of the different types of diseases that we see with carnations. When we sit back and look at the research that was done, the control, some of the great pathologists, one of the great ones was Tex Baker, who literally his name was referred to, tall guy from Colorado State, traveled the world teaching people on how to manage the whole virus and fusarium and pythium world that basically plagued the carnation business. So when we start looking at it, we go back to, what did Tex say? Because what Tex said back in the late 60s and 70s when he perfected clean stock, he said you have to have clean stock because without clean stock, we can't be virus free. So that is a basic truth of when we're growing carnation. And of course, today we're talking about not cut carnations, but we're talking about potted carnations. These are the great products for anyone that's in this industry, for the bedding plant industry. They have phenomenal shelf life in the spring. So this is one of those products, Bill, that you can, get into bloom for Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, get there in the garden center. They look great, they smell great, they make people think of spring, and they really are something that lasts well in the garden. So this is really darn near the perfect crop. I don't know if you had carnations in your garden, Bill?
No, but I've definitely given them as gifts, and I do think they make fantastic gifts. I also think that going by the words of anyone named Tex is probably a safe bet in life.
Yep.
And when you flip through old issues of Grower Talks, they're loaded up with articles about carnations, and it's been a staple crop for generations, and I'm sure is going to continue to be because it really does hit on all of those key selling attributes that you just talked about. I think it's a great crop. It's a beautiful gift crop. Everyone's gonna smile when you hand them a carnation. And putting them in the garden is it's something I've not done, but I'm certainly willing to give it a try. So I think that, we've talked in the past about the basics of at-risk crops. I think it's definitely worth going over again some of the, I like the way that you lay out the disease triangle and how to use that to assess the risk and to come up with the correct solutions. And maybe you can take us through that again real quick.
Right. And this is a quintessential crop where you really have the plant, which it can be very susceptible to some diseases that we'll talk about, that if you don't have the disease present, you don't have a problem. But if you got the disease present, you do have a problem. The environment does play a big role in it because if you don't manage your environment, you basically increase the risk of these problems. So we're going to talk about all those things. Number one rule, as Tex said, clean stock. Make sure that you got certified clean stock. Next is that you have to have a clean production facility. Really important because one of the diseases we're going to talk about is fusarium. Fusarium can be in the water. Pythium, another disease, it can be in the water. They're both in the soil. And so if you basically put your plants in contact with soil that has Pythium or fusarium, or you're using water that has Pythium or fusarium, then you're not a clean production facility, you're going to have problems. You want to make sure you got optimum cultural protocols, that you're not staying too wet too long, because that sets you up for Pythium, which then sets you up for this disease triangle of this trifecta that really does carnations in. And then, of course, monitoring and controlling pests is always a big concern. So, Bill, let's go ahead and let's talk about, one of my favorite crops, because it brings back so many great memories of carnations. And it is an at-risk crop if you don't manage it, but if you manage them, it's really a fairly easy crop to grow. So should we talk a little bit about some of these risks? Because it is really three primary factors that you want to manage when you're looking at carnations. The first one is a virus. There's a number of viruses, there's a whole host of viruses, but most of them can be cleaned up, and that they're fairly easy to keep out of your carnation crop. The one that we're most concerned with is carnation mottle virus. The reason is it is very common. Because it's common, it's because it's very easy to spread. It's highly infectious. You get it on your fingers and you start touching your plants, you can very quickly get it infected into your plants. Insects will carry it. It's not real clear which ones, but there are some insects that will carry carnation mottle virus from plant to plant. That's why when you buy your carnations, you need to make sure they are all certified as clean. You can't have some clean and some that are dirty. That's a prescription for failure. One of the interesting things is carnation mottle virus generally does not show any symptoms. We got in the PowerPoint, we got a great picture of the symptoms. It's a little streaky, mottly look. It's not as streaked as you saw if you looked at the canavirus talk. But if on the carnation mottle, it is a mottling of the foliage. And of course, appropriately, we got to even have a picture of what the virus looks like. And it's kind of this nondescript ball, right, Bill? It's like, okay, so it's a virus. So that's carnation mottle. We normally don't see any symptoms unless you have two other problems. The first problem that you run into is if you have fusarium, specifically Fusarium oxysporium. Fusarium is a systemic disease. It gets inside the plants, it plugs up the vascular bundle, so the plant can't take up water. If it doesn't take up water, the leaves start to die. In fact, that's usually the symptom, is that we call it branch death, where you have a single branch that dies. Very typical. Starts with the lower leaves, turn yellow, even though you're feeding them and the salts are right and the water's right, but you get fusarium. If you cut the stem, you can see a vascular bundle being black. You get these wilted branches. And the other thing that's very interesting, and this is something Tex Baker worked out back in the 70s, was an aha moment for him, is that Pythium is an integral part of the fusarium infection process from the soil. So it's kind of an interesting, you call it symbiotic relationship if you were fusarium and Pythium, because what happens is the Pythium basically damages the root system, cracks the root, creates an opening for the fusarium, which is a weak pathogen, to come sailing into the plant, and off you go, and you've got dead. So it's basically a combination of, if you control Pythium, you generally don't have fusarium, but if you don't control Pythium and you got a little fusarium, well, that's just playing with fire. So, does that make sense, Bill, that you got these three things that kind of work together?
It does, and the common factor I see is that it's really going to come down to cleanliness, right? Cleanliness in your stock, cleanliness in your facility, really staying on top of these, because you certainly don't want a plant that looks like the one up on the top, because you're not going to sell it. Right. So why don't you move on to what growers can do to minimize these risks and take that ugly picture of the virus off the screen?
Okay, let's talk about how you manage it. Of course, we've kind of beat on this, but starting with clean stock, clean unrooted cuttings, clean rooted liners, and there are a number of suppliers that have these available where they're virus and fusarium clean. If you have clean stock, you're going to be fusarium and virus clean. They make sure that you don't have a mixture of non-clean stock and clean stock. That's a no-no with a big N and a big O. Make sure that you've got the plants not stressed, because if you start stressing the plants and you didn't keep them clean, you're going to start expressing carnation mottle virus, which is a very big problem. The thing about fusarium is you've got to be aware of the fact that it is waterborne. I remember a greenhouse in my first job where all the greenhouse water that came out of the bottom of the soil drained into a pond, and guess what their water supply was, Bill?
Ooh, the pond.
Yeah, the pond. And they didn't use chlorine to disinfect. The chlorine is the best disinfectant for fusarium. And what, of course, they were just re-inoculating the plants that they just planted. And so it was this vicious cycle. In fact, that vicious cycle is what killed off the carnation business in Colombia, is because they just kept reinfecting field after field because they failed to control the fusarium that was in the water, which contaminated the soil that they planted the plants in. So you need to have clean pots. You need to use clean, fresh soil, and you need to make sure your water has been disinfected. Of course, one of the things that we need to manage is we need to manage pythium, because as I said, this is basically the trifecta, where if you get pythium, it damages the roots, gets the fusarium, and then if you've got any carnation mottle around, it starts expressing them. So if one thing doesn't kill them, the rest does. So what do we do with pythium? Is, of course, we all know about how to control pythium. It's a well understood control strategy. And you basically, the easiest thing to do is make sure that your soil goes dry, that you basically take it from a level 4 down to a level 2 about every 48 hours. Because if you start wandering beyond 48 hours, the soil sits wet, and that's one of the things Tech Baker saw: wet soil, pythium, fusarium, and then you're off and you're dead. And so you must really think about it, and you have to control it before you have the disease. Now, we do have some different recommendations on fusarium control in the PowerPoint and also in the longer document that you may want to look at, because you need to get your fusarium chemicals on before you might have fusarium, because it's a protectant more than a curative. So you really need to be out there trying to control that ahead of it. So those are really the kind of the 1-2 plan of how you control these diseases: clean stock, control pythium, control fusarium, and this is a really easy crop to grow.
Excellent, excellent. And you did reference that we will have a link to the slideshow in the show notes if you're listening to this as a podcast, also on the YouTube channel. And yeah, before we wrap up, let me just call out some additional resources to check out. You can see them here on the screen. First is a set of at-risk crop guidelines or white papers that are available at ballseed.com/quickculture/production guides. And you'll find them there in a group, and you can pretty easily work your way through all the different at-risk crops that we've been talking about. Also is the Tech on Demand podcast, brought to you by Grower Talks. So in addition to episodes like this one, we cover all sorts of topics on the podcast, from greenhouse specifics to pest and disease control. Kind of like this one, and you're going to find a lot of those at Tech on Demand podcast, which you can find on pretty much every podcast app: Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, all of them. And you can visit growertalks.com/tech-on-demand to find all episodes as well. So Will, thank you so much for taking the time to take us through carnations, a crop near and dear to your heart, and introducing us to techs. And all the work the team does to put together the information on at-risk crops and help growers succeed. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
And I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, wishing you a fantastic season. Hopefully you'll pick up some carnations this year and send them to market, because you know that customers are out there that are going to really love seeing this crop back and giving them as gifts and putting them in their garden. So take care.